Today's reading comes from Mark's Gospel, and it's chapter 8, verses 31 to 38. The first time that Jesus speaks about his suffering and his death. A passage that occurs immediately after Peter's declaration about who Jesus is when he makes that jaw-dropping statement where he says, "You are the Messiah." Then Jesus began to teach his disciples, "The Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. He will be put to death, but 3 days later he will rise to life." He made this very clear to them. So Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But Jesus turned round, looked at his disciples, and rebuked Peter. "Get away from me, Satan," he said. "Your thoughts don't come from God, but from man." Then Jesus called the crowd and his disciples to him. "If anyone wants to come with me," he told them, "he must forget self, carry his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his own life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. Does a person gain anything if he wins the whole world but loses his life? Of course not. There is nothing he can give to regain his life. If a person is ashamed of me and of my teachings in this godless and wicked day, then the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." So the position and the structure of this material is so very, very important. We have, just before what's referred to as the Caesarea Philippi experience, the time when Jesus asks the disciples who they think he is. In Mark's Gospel, uniquely, we have a healing miracle where Jesus restores the sight of a blind man. And he does this in 2 stages. There's an initial healing, and then the man says he can see things, but they're all rather fuzzy. And then Jesus applies his hands to him, and the man's sight is fully restored. And it is in that sense of Jesus being the one who can gradually bring us to a situation where we can see clearly that the rest of the whole gospel carries forwards. Because up to this point, all of the encounters that Jesus has had with people, all the healings, all the miracles, all the teachings, they pose the question to the reader of Mark's Gospel and to the individuals who Jesus met, some of whom came on to follow him and some of whom didn't. The question comes, who is this man? Who is this person, Jesus? And at that turning point of the gospel, when Jesus turns to the disciples and says, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Messiah." That's followed immediately by Jesus saying, "Don't tell anyone about me," which sounds contrary and sounds odd. But it's all to do with the use of this word Messiah. Peter says, "You are the Messiah." Now, obviously, that's a term, and like all terms, different people will have different interpretations about what that meant. But what it definitely meant was a sense of being able to conquer your enemies through power, whether that's military might or even spiritual might. But you would have the inescapable ability to squash your enemies, to achieve your will, to impose a rule upon people. And in a time when the country was occupied by the Romans, that's what people really wanted. And Israel's history is peppered with occupations and exodus and exiles and a whole bunch of things where foreign powers overrun the nation. They're very familiar with this whole idea. And to be free of such oppression was a great, strong theme through people's thinking. So Peter says to him, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus says, "Don't tell people that." And he goes on to say, "the Son of Man," which is the phrase that he uses to describe himself. Because Messiah just doesn't cut it. It has all the wrong connotations. Jesus describes himself as the Son of Man, the suffering servant, the one who must die for his people, not the military conqueror that Peter has him say. But with this revelation, however badly expressed, the disciples have shown themselves to have received from God insight into who Jesus is. No longer do they ask amongst themselves, who is this person? Or are they totally amazed by what happens? They finally are able to grasp that God-given ability to see in Jesus, not some ragamuffin from Bethlehem, but somebody who is indeed God in human form. It's a revelation which is always God-given, but they glimpse it for a moment and express it, and they feel rather pleased with themselves. Jesus tells them what it really means, that he is not that kind of Messiah. He is the Son of Man, and that all the Jewish authorities, the whole council, his own people, his own rulers, not this oppressive army that's occupying the country, but his own leaders will put him to death. And Peter, speaking on behalf of everybody else, turns around and uses that word rebuke is there. Because surely that can't happen. That's not what they want to happen. They want this military ruler. Well, not necessarily military, but they want this power. They want this person to come and make everything better. If they really do have this God-given power, then surely now is the time to address all those lengthy, long-standing national woes and to restore the nation to a true state of holiness. These are all intentions of the best sort. But Jesus rebukes him most strongly. Get away from me, Satan, he says. Your thoughts don't come from God, but from man. And here is an encounter for all time. Because whenever anybody experiences God in their lives, the first thing, if it's a true and authentic encounter, is to be completely and utterly blown away by God's majesty, by God's beauty, by God's love, by God's power, and by God's strength. Completely and utterly blown away. But the second thing, of course, is to have been in the presence of such glory and wonder and might. Surely that has an implication for ourselves and an implication for the things that we believe are important. Surely our aspirations will now come true with God on our side, people have sung throughout history. There is a sense at which if God is for you, and the phrase goes, who can be against you? But surely all the things I need, all the things I want are possible because I have this mighty power for me. But of course, nobody can control what God thinks or what God does. It is not for us to contain or constrain the God who had made us from the dust of the stars and who loves us beyond words. Doesn't mean that God is our genie, that God is attuned to the things that we have believed to be important. That is not how it is. Jesus goes on to say, if anyone wants to come with me, he must forget self, carry his cross, and follow me. Now, we're quite familiar to that metaphor or that image of the cross. And whilst we understand its horrific nature, to the people who were told this initially, this was a serious downer. The shadow of the cross lay all over the road to Jerusalem. And as people walked with Jesus, he was to teach them more and more that this was what was going to happen, that personal suffering and death could well be the result of following in Jesus' footsteps. Why? Because unconditional love, a life lived without prejudice, a life focused on what God wants rather than what people want, is always going to be in conflict with the priorities and with the tradition of people who strive for their own personal satisfaction, their own safety, their own wealth, their own status, and to conform to the society in which we live. There is always going to be that conflict, because love knows no barriers. Love knows no prejudice. Love is not interested in the self, but rather on the other. And this is how God relates to us. The material that Mark gathers in these final verses, 35, 36, 37, have been constructed out of a different set of traditions. The material isn't meant to be historical, it's gathered together to make a point. And the confusion for us reading this passage about life is because the word life has different translations in the Greek. In the original translation, the passage talks of the contrast between physical life and spiritual life, and the two are different things, and that it is far better to look for spiritual life than physical life. Physical life will fail and can be taken away from us, but spiritual life is eternal, and our relationship with God is a spiritual one. So Jesus is making the contrast in this material that Mark has gathered together quite artificially, that it is the spiritual life that one should quest for. But again, the timeless teaching of this particular lesson is that we cannot control God. That when you hear people getting frustrated with God, it is because they have their own set of values, their own ideas. Think of the classic ethical question. If God is a God of love, then why is there suffering? Well, you have to, again, return to this theme. Who are we to control God? Yes, our own suffering, or the suffering we perceive in the world, or the suffering we see on behalf of those we love and care for, can be absolutely heart-wrenching, can be completely all-consuming. But that is still just us. And God is not God of our desires. And the way we want things to turn out, the things that we would see as success, are not God's ways. Jesus had very little to say about how to live in the world. Give the coin back to Caesar because his head is on it. Jesus wasn't concerned about conforming to this world. He came to show us the kingdom of heaven breaking in. And it is our deep joy and privilege to have come into that awareness and to have experienced God in our lives so that our hearts are warmed and our lives are transformed. We are made new, not just in the sense that we have joy and assurance and peace, but our priorities are different. No longer can career or health be the primary aims of our physical life, for we quest for a spiritual life, a close relationship with the God who made us and the God who loves us, a close relationship with God, because that is what is going to be eternal. That is what will persist beyond this physical life. And whoever wants to come with Jesus must forget self. It's the words of the Great Commandment, isn't it? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. It means forgetting self, putting your own desires on the back burner, because you have something that is so much better, so much greater, so much richer, and so much stronger. All our lives focused on what God would have us do, because God is so great.